Well, hello BookTube, it's Roz, and it's 3/4 of the way through October, which means it's time for a November TBR. And well, I had sensible September when I tried to keep my September plans within bounds, and then total immersion Victober, which has been going really well. So fewer things but longer, being Victorian novels. But November, I seem to have gone a bit nutty for November. Yes, running a bit wild. But I'm optimistic that I will read everything. Partly because I've got a week's holiday, a kind of holiday at home in the middle of November. So fingers crossed. That means I'll get through all of the lovely things that I want to read. And one of the reasons why I've ended up with too many things for November is that there are two great November events that I want to take part in. One of them is Indigathon and the other is Nonfiction November. And I've also got 3 irresistible buddy reads that I've said yes to. And if I want to fulfill my scallydandling goals for the year, I need to get in another new to me country in November. So here goes. Let me tell you what I've got planned, and you can tell me that I'm completely daft thinking I'm going to read all this. So, Nonfiction November, first up. I'll link to an announcement video by Oliver the Book Olive. But the key thing with Nonfiction November is to say just read more nonfiction than you normally would, even if that's just one thing. But there are 4 prompts: industry, style, treatment, and collection. And I've got something for each prompt. They're quite loose prompts, which is lucky. Now, my first planned book is also a bit of a Victober hangover because it's The Artful Dickens by John Mullan, and I'm just sort of starting it towards the end of Victober, and then we'll complete it in November. And this is my book for the prompt industry. Why, do you say? Can you explain that as to why that fits with industry? Well, Charles Dickens, was an extraordinarily prolific author, I would say. He wrote 15 novels, several novellas, hundreds of short stories and articles. He was also, also journalism, edited magazines, did lecture tours. He was like a one-man literary industry. So that's my justification. And I'm quite and he did that without ever resorting to writing real pot boilers, things just for the sake of it. So I'm quite interested in understanding how he did that, and I'm hoping that that's what the lovely John Mullan will tell me, because the sort of subtitle for this is The Tricks and Ploys of the Great Novelist. We'll see. Now, prompt number 2 is treatment, and that's kind of ever so slightly Victober related too, because Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot was talking about 19th century books that he was reading that weren't necessarily from Britain, but from that same era. And he read something called 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nelly Bly, who was a American journalist. And this book was actually, it's the story of a kind of undercover assignment that she took in 1887 to get herself committed into a lunatic asylum so that she'd be able to report on how the women there were treated. It sounds absolutely fascinating, really looking forward to it. And, great to read something by a 19th century woman journalist. So I'm up for that one. And I think Tilly's going to read that with me, which would be nice. Then next prompt is style. And for that, I'm going to read a book by Eric Newby called A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush. Now, Newby was a travel writer, and A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush he kind of wrote in 1958. And how do I justify that being for style? Well, he wrote this book about the journey he went and did after 17 years of working in the fashion industry, when he decided to kind of restyle himself as an adventurer and a travel writer, and this was the book that established his travel writing style, and almost like it's one that's been widely, I guess, imitated since. So it's fun and anecdotal, and I'm looking forward to it. Quite a light-hearted book, I think. Now, the fourth prompt is collection. Okay, and the book I'm reading for collection is a collection of stories, but reported folk tales rather than fiction, if that makes sense. So it's on that sort of non-fiction fiction crossover, but I think one can reasonably call it non-fiction. But it also links to my next event, Indigathon. So before I say more about that book that I'm going to read for collection, I'm going to say that I may also read The Years by Annie Ernaux, which has been described as a collection of recollections. French author, she wrote it in 2008, I think. So it's a memoir, but in a kind of collection form. I hope to fit that in, but we'll see. Before I move off Nonfiction November, I want to say, if you are a non-fiction reader or someone that wants to read more non-fiction and would like to do something that might inspire your non-fiction reading next year, not for Nonfiction November, earlier in the year, please think about signing up for the BookTubePrize to be a judge. Now, I'll link to the judge recruitment video so that you can find out more. But I know that there are definitely plenty of spaces left for in particular for judges for the non-fiction group, also for the other groups, fiction and fiction in translation. But it would be a great way of kind of tricking yourself into reading some of the best of the preceding 12 months new non-fiction. So that's the advert. Going back to this book, which is my fourth non-fiction choice and my first Indigathon choice. And it's Legends of Vancouver by Pauline Johnson, or also known by her other name, Tekahionwake. Now, what's Indigathon, shall we say first? Indigathon is another yearly readathon. I will link to videos by the hosts, who are Michelle of Thor Wants Another Letter and Bear of F2 Brody. When you have to go to Instagram to find the prompts for this, but the absolute core of Indigathon is to get us reading more books by Indigenous writers. Not necessarily North American, Indigenous writers from anywhere in the world, writers of the of Indigenous origin for the country where they are from, particularly from countries where those Indigenous communities have become marginalised by colonialism, as it were, and settlers. Yeah, so that's and there's a world of tremendous literature out there to get into and enjoy, and but the four and there's 6 prompts, and I'm picking up on a couple of them, but it's not essential, I suppose, to use the prompts. That's just to add extra flavour, and the prompts are found on Instagram, as I say. So, Legends of Vancouver is a book that came out in 1911, and Pauline Johnson, or Tekahionwake, is a Canadian poet. She was of mixed heritage. Her father was a Six Nations chief of Mohawk heritage, and her mother was an Englishwoman who was living on a Six Nations reserve and met him, and they came together, and she's their daughter. There she is on the front of this. So that was on the eastern side of what is now Canada, but these stories are from Vancouver, and I was particularly keen to read these because my brother and his family and various of my nieces and nephews live in Vancouver. But these stories were told to her by her friend, who was Chief Joe Capilano of the Squamish people, and their Squamish legends, including kind of like origin myths about the geographical features in the area, and there is a sort of classic, I guess, of Canadian literature. She was also a poet. and a performer, a really interesting sounding woman, in fact. And I'm looking forward to finding out more about her, as well as more about the stories of the people from that part of Canada, which is a part that I've visited and feel I know. Now, having read that, it feels lovely to connect to a contemporary Indigenous poet from North America. And so I'm going to read Whereas, which is a 2017 collection by Oglala Lakota writer Layli Long Soldier. And this has been recommended by a couple of booktubers that whose opinion I value, Mark and Courtney, I think. But it sounds particularly interesting to me in that she wrote it as a response to the 2009 congressional apology to the Native peoples of the United States that was sort of signed off by Barack Obama, but was then kept quite, not exactly secret, but it's one of those qualified, apologies that isn't really, I don't know. It will be really interesting to see how she responds to that in poetry. Anyway, I'm quite keen about that one. I am even keener about the next Indigathon choice that I'm going to read, because I'm going to read something that's a bit of a booktube darling at the moment, I suppose, in many ways, and that's Noopiming, or The Cure for White Ladies, and that's by the Canadian Indigenous author Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. And I've heard so many enthusiastic reviews of this from a variety of people, including Brown Bookish was one of them. And it's a novel, but an experimental novel. It's sort of almost like poetic little excerpts, and well, who knows what it's really like. I will find out, and I'll tell you what I think when I've read it. Now, my fourth Indigathon choice, I'm slightly cheating. Well, not cheating, because I've already read it. I read it in October. But there's a good excuse for why I read it in October and instead of during Indigathon. And that's because I read it to make a discussing drama video with Tilly, as I always do, but also with Sean the Book Maniac. And Sean kindly offered to edit that and get it ready in time for us to put up during Indigathon in November. But we had to do it in October to allow that. But the play is Dry Lips or To Move to Kapuskading by Cree playwright Tomson Highway, which came out in 1989. And I'll say nothing more about it because the video is already made. So what else? What else this month? Well, I mentioned was drawn into three irresistible buddy reads. One is of The Shadow King by Ethiopian-American author Maaza Mengiste, and it's her 2019 book. I read her the previous book, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, and really rated that, so I was keen to read it, and I mentioned that, and Emily of Novell Novels and Katja Weinart of Read Write Create said, well, yes, we'd be up for that, so I'm really looking forward to that. When I did the Mooks and Gripes bucket list tag, it's Sean's fault again, I mentioned there about not having read some really major books from sort of classics of from other parts of the world, despite being a scallywandling reader, as I say. And one of those, the one that I said I most wanted to read, was the posthumous Memoirs of Cubas, which is an 1881 Brazilian novel by Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis. And so I'm reading that, and I'm reading it with Sina of Beating Around the Books and Albert of Seriella. So I'm really thinking that could be a special book, and I'm all hyped for that one. Naughty old Sean is involved in my third buddy read, though, because knowing my sort of predilection for reading books from around the world, from more far-flung places, or places with a less well-known literary heritage, shall we say, he suggested that we read together The Old Man and His Sons, which is 1970 novel by a Faroese author, Hedin Bru. And if you don't know what I mean by Faroese, the Faroe Islands are a little archipelago in the North Atlantic. The nearest neighbours are actually the Shetland Islands that belong that are part of Scotland. But the Faroes are kind of part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but they have their own language and their own culture. And I'm delighted at the thought of reading a book from the Faroes. But because that is technically not a new country, because it's kind of allied to Denmark, I also need to fit in one actual new country into my month, and so I hope and plan finally, last one, to read a book from St Kitts and Nevis. So this came out in 2008. It's a short novel by someone called Bertram Roach, and it's called Only God Can Make a Tree. And I know virtually nothing about it other than the fact that it's from St Kitts. So what the hell? I'm going to read it. That's my lovely November plans. Do you think I've bitten off more than I can chew? And what are you reading in November? Do tell me, particularly if you're doing Nonfiction November, or even more so if you're doing Indigathon.